Okay, so I'm going to talk tonight about the second book, which came out in March from WSU Press. They also did the first book 2 years ago, which was Peace Weavers. I also want to thank Carol Tashima, who has moved away but has worked for many years on getting speakers, and she worked so hard on getting this last list before she left town. And I want to thank my husband, Mike, who always carries my stuff for me. And the Historical Society that has borne with me for 21 years since I started this project. Every Christmas I would get up in front for my 5 minutes and say, well, I'm still researching and writing, but not done yet, and finally got done. So my subject that I've been working on all these years is the Indigenous community mothers of Whatcom County and the towns therein who never made it into the history books. There's a saying among historians that historians are always surprised their subject waited for them. And when I first started this, part of the job was to look for comparable books, and there just weren't any out there anywhere in the United States. So then my project grew from being a 2-year project in which I would publish perhaps in the historical journal and do a couple of talks to something much larger. So the women that made it into the 2 books, there's 4 in each book, are the women who were married to county officials, army officers, and other important settlers, and the contributions that these women made to us. A second thing that guided me was David McCullough, the historian, famous historian who wrote Truman and a lot of other books. He says, write the book you want to read. And so that's what I worked at all those years. I'd look at a chapter and say, would I want to read this or not? And so that's what I worked toward. And my friend George Adams from Nooksack gave me my third guiding principle. He says, half histories are half truths, and half truths are lies. So that's what I'm working on. And the fourth thing that guided me is, what is the legacy that these women left behind for us today? We tend to think that when people in the 1800s died, they're just kind of gone into the ether, and we're just a completely different town, and that isn't necessarily true. So it's been kind of hard for me to pick bits and pieces out of Interwoven Lives to tell you about tonight, but trust me, there's a whole lot more in the books than what I'm going to say. In the first book, if people haven't read it or haven't heard me talk about it, there were 4 women. Caroline Davis Kavanaugh. Caroline was first married to Lieutenant Robert Davis here, who was the nephew of Jefferson Davis. Her second husband was Sheriff James Kavanaugh, and they were one of the first 2 families on March Point down in Skagit County. The second woman was Nellie Lane, who married the superintendent of schools, who before that was Sheriff Lane when she married him, and they were one of the founding families of Lummi Island, and have maybe 400 descendants today who are very talented in huge numbers of field, including a doctor, Dr. Dakota Lane, who a couple years ago came back here after he finished medical school in order to be a doctor out at Lummi Reservation. The third woman was Mary Fitzhugh Lear Phillips. She was married to the coal mine manager who became a territorial Supreme Court justice. Her second husband was William King Lear, who was the sutler out at Fort Bellingham and then became an entrepreneur, tried to sell lots on Semiahmoo Spit without having any title to them at all. Eventually, he went to Alaska and became a founder of Wrangell, Alaska. The fourth woman was Clara Tennant, daughter of the wisest, really, they don't say chiefs in Coast Salish language culture, but very top man out at Lummi. and she married John Tennant. We have Tennant Lake here. He was a legislator, probate judge, superintendent of schools, many other things, and then they both became Methodist missionaries and built the first church in Ferndale, the first church in Linden, and a couple other first churches that they built and put their own money into them. She's a wonderful woman. So very briefly to what I talked about before, intermarriage between Native women and European men started as soon as the Spanish hit the shores of the Caribbean. And by 1514, about 40% of Spanish men's marriages were intermarriages. These were good and bad. These were kidnappings. These were rapes. These were love matches. This just spanned the gamut. When we had the westward movement in this country, intermarriages actually started on the East Coast. Most of the men who were leaders of Indian rebellions were actually the sons of intermarriages. But we end up with clusters of intermarriages that become cities and towns: Chicago, Detroit, Green Bay, San Antonio, Santa Fe. We get to Washington. We get, Bellingham, Ferndale, Linden, Sequim and Port Angeles, Wenatchee, Colville, Chewelah, Spokane. Not too long ago, somebody contacted me that said Bow at one time had been a small community, and that was also founded by an intermarried couple. So 80 to 90% of the married couples in our first 20 years of legal existence here, so we're talking 1854 to about 1874, 80 to 90% of the couples here were intermarried couples. When the books about our history were written, we only hear about the 6 nice white ladies, who I admire a lot, but they're not the only women who contributed to who we became. That was Elizabeth Roeder, Teresa Eldridge, Mary Lyle, Maria Roberts, Mary Bird Tawes, and then Phoebe Judson. So in the first 5 years of our legal existence, starting 1853, we had 4 waves of men who came in here, and from them came the men who contracted these marriages. 1853, we had the mill workers. The next year, the coal mine workers, which included John Tennant. 1856, the Army Company. All 3 officers married Native women. And in 1858, the Fraser River gold miners who camped on our beaches, then they went up to Fraser River, found out they still weren't going to make any money, and a bunch of them decided that Whatcom County really looked pretty good to settle down in. So they contracted marriages and stayed here. What is ignored is that the families of the women had their own agendas. These weren't just men who went and got a girl to be his housekeeper. These were tribal custom marriages, and the fathers and the mothers had the things that they wanted from these men. Economic advantages, someone to mediate with the new authorities that were here, a source of employment for the boys in the family. There was also Indian divorce, which is what one of the women got from Lieutenant Forsyth, and then she married Chief Henry Quina. So in the 1870s then, you started having large numbers of all-white couples move here, and they came with their Protestant ministers. And these folks had standards of what society should be, and they looked down on all these intermarried couples. And so in 1878, 9 of our husbands were indicted for fornication. And these were men who had now been married for 20 and 30 years and had like 6 children. And they were criminally indicted for fornication. However, one of them stood up and said, "I am not remarrying my wife. We have been married all these years." And so Chief Justice Roger Green issued an opinion between court sessions that legitimized all tribal custom marriages by saying marriage is a contract between 2 people. It has nothing to do with churches or county governments. Those are there for the convenience of those folks. But the contract, and he used Adam and Eve as his example, because he was a very religious guy, that there was no minister there when Adam and Eve got married. It was a contract. And if you negate that contract, then we must negate all contract law that has happened since then, which would have meant everybody's real estate law, all their wills, everything would have been voided. So the argument died, the indictments were dropped. So this is probably going to be the last time that I talk about these women, because I'm off on a new subject. So I kind of want to give a shout out to the women who did not make the top 8. I started off with 21 of them, and gradually over the 20 years, I dropped them for one reason or another, usually because I came to a brick wall and couldn't find more information. But I may do something with them at some point. So one was Mary Briggs, who was Maitre Bay. She married John Briggs, the county auditor. Another was Fanny Richardson, who was Samish. She married George Richardson, our first teacher, and a miner. Their daughter, Fanny Richardson Barrett, was half Samish and Sklallam. She married Tom Barrett, who was a merchant, a farmer, and an amateur veterinarian. Julia Seahome, so she was the daughter of Chief Seahome, that we all know that name now as Seahome. She married first, and she was Samish and Sklallam. She married first E.C. Fitzhugh, the coal mine manager and territorial justice. After that, she was married to Henry Barkhausen, the county auditor, and he's the one that stood up and said, I'm not remarrying Julia. I call her the happy whirlwind, and we've been married all these years. We've got 6 kids, not remarrying her. He said he wouldn't shame her. Mary Forsyth Quina was first married to Lieutenant James Forsyth, who became the Wounded Knee Massacre commander 30 years later. She got an Indian divorce after he left here for the Civil War and married Chief Henry Quina of the Lummi and lived happily ever after. Northwest Indian College sits on their allotment. Her daughter with Forsyth was Teresa Forsyth Finkbonner. So she's half Swinomish. She married Charles Finkbonner, the son of the first farmer in charge out at Lummi, and they have a very large group of descendants today. Cecilia Kennerly Clark was Semyama, daughter of the man who was the go-between between the native salmon fishery on the Fraser River and the Hudson Bay Company. His name was Shehanuk. And her first husband was Dr. C.B.R. Kennerly, the Smithsonian naturalist and surgeon on the International Boundary Survey. Second, she was married to Billy Clark, who had the ferry on the Nooksack River there at Ferndale, where Pioneer Park sits today. And then third, she married a man named Joe Toby from Lummi and moved out there. Annie Richards was Nooksack. She was married to Charles Richards, who was one of the owners and merchants of the brick store that Wes just talked about, which later became our courthouse. Nina McClanahan was Nooksack, married to Dan McClanahan, who was a partner in the Patterson Ranch out where Linden is today, the county's first dairy business. Emma Hyatt Taylor was Lummi. She was first married to John Hyatt, our first postmaster and an employee at the Richards store, and second married James Taylor, who was a shipwright and was the builder of Henry Roeder's vessels that came out of here. And last was Marianne Bertrand, who was Nooksack, who married James Bertrand, and Blaine sits on their land today. So one thing I do in the book, if you haven't seen either one, is that I look at her history, his history, their history together, what happened later, and what happened to their children. Because I believe that if you're going to look at a marriage, you've got to look at both sides of it for the baggage that people bring to their marriage. And if you've ever been married, you know that both people are bringing stuff in that may go back 3 and 4 generations even So the first woman is Jenny Winn. Her husband was Tom Winn, the Quaker blacksmith. Her father was the Lummi treaty signer Sihanolt, who was one of 7 half-brothers who were the most influential men out at Lummi, included Chawitsut and Salik, who was Clara Tennant's father. Her mother was the daughter of the man the whites called King Freezy, who was Songhee's leader out on Vancouver Island, and more than once paddled over here to let the people that were living in the settlement his daughter was living in, or his granddaughter was living in, to know that the Northern Raiders were coming. Tom Winn was a descendant of Dr. Thomas Winn, William Penn's best friend and surgeon, who came over to found Philadelphia. The house and the land that Tom grew up on is the oldest inhabited home in Philadelphia today. And one great story is why his grandmother and his grandfather managed to shoot 3 British soldiers and bury them in the front yard, where they still are today. Jenny is a woman who, that phrase we use today, speak truth to power. And when 9 months pregnant, she spoke up during a reservation boundary dispute, and they made her go home because, women shouldn't speak up in a men's meeting. She developed her own business. She smoked hams using the methods she had learned at Lummi. And her kids said they never got to eat ham at home because she would smoke 30 at a time and then hang them for a very long time. And as soon as they were ready to go, people from town bought them immediately and bought every one, so the family never had any. She and her husband, Tom, donated land for our second rural school and granted the right-of-way for the railroad bridge crossing at Ferndale, which is where that bridge is right where it was today. We're lucky that their children did a lot of interviews with our early historian Howard Buswell about the early days in this county. This is how her chapter begins. From miles away, Jenny and Tom Winn heard the booms when 200-foot Douglas firs and cedars exploded in flames and crashed to the ground, spewing incandescent embers into the swirling winds. Bits of the 600-year-old patriarchs flew miles ahead of the fire and smoke born in Canada that consumed Whatcom County mile after mile during the summer of 1868. Over 3 terrible days, the fire swept through the small prairies, trees, and brushy bottom along the Nooksack River, embers igniting 8-foot thick stumps, sawdust, and everything in their path. Wild animals, livestock, and people found safety together on the beach ahead of the towering flames. Armed only with shovels and pails, the Winns refused to allow the wild inferno to take their farm. They battled the fire day and night, choking and nearly blinded by the thick smoke, slapping its sparks on their hair and clothes. Perhaps the oldest children were safe at Lummi Reservation with their grandmother, or with neighbors who fled into town when their farms burned. But Jenny's toddler, Harry, was with her. Years later, when people asked him to describe his Lummi mother, he told their story. When things were at their worst, Jenny saw that she must think of Harry's survival, even if she could not save herself. She dug a small pit in the clearing between house and barn and trusted in her people's traditional final defense. Jenny wrapped her frightened, choking little son in wet blankets and placed him down in the pit. If the unthinkable happened, Harry might survive. The Winns emerged unhurt, with only the market garden and some fences lost. The epic fire moved on to other farms and the settlements around the bay. It continued south for hundreds of miles until the vast Columbia River and autumn rains halted its advance. So the second woman is Elizabeth Patterson. If you got the newsletter, we put quite a bit about her in there. She was Snoqualmie, daughter of Pat Canham, the most powerful Native leader in western Washington because he and his brothers controlled all 3 passes over the Cascades that served as trade routes. Her mother, we believe, was Yakima because the Snoqualmie and the Yakima intermarried a lot. She grew up at Tolt Village, which is today's Carnation, near Snoqualmie Falls, which is, if you've read a little bit in the paper lately about the tribe has now bought back the lodge. They believe that is their creation spot and that the mists of the falls carry their prayers up to heaven. And so it's a very important place for them. In the Treaty War of 1855-56, Pat Canham surprisingly fought on the side of the whites. He went for what he felt would do the best for his own people, as opposed to all of the Coast Salish. She and the rest of the family were interned at Holmes Harbor, where quite a number of people died of food poisoning. Her sisters, her older sisters, both married Hudson Bay Company men, one of whom was Thomas Glasgow. If you've ever read the history of Whidbey Island and that first attempt at settlement, one of the men was Thomas Glasgow, who was warned by an Indian woman that he needed to leave or get killed, and that woman was indeed his wife, Julia. James Patterson, Elizabeth's husband, was from Tennessee, where his father was sheriff of Greenville, and one of his best friends was Andrew Johnson, who later became President Andrew Johnson. One of 9 sons, the family ended up moving to Missouri, where they were running cattle down the Santa Fe Trail with Kit Carson and others, and then started supplying livestock to the people heading out on the Oregon Trail. Eventually, he and several other brothers went to California, where they did all kinds of cattle-related things, and 2 brothers founded towns down there. But he wasn't the nicest guy, and I think he was the oldest brother. I think they gave him $1,000 and kind of said, "Go north, young man." So he and his partner, Reuben Beiser, started running cattle up here. They were on Snoqualmie Prairie, and that's where he met Elizabeth and married her there. Then they came up to Squahallich Prairie, which is across the river from today's Linden. We're given the impression that they just moved into those lovely prairies where Linden is today, and they run all along the north side of the river there, with the village of Squahallich across the river. And that is just not true. The Nooksacks did not want people there. They didn't mind them passing through, but they didn't want them settling there. And the only reason that he and Beiser and then Dan McClanahan and several others got to stay there was because they married Nooksack women. And Elizabeth, as a highborn Snoqualmie woman, would have also been known to everybody at Nooksack. So then James starts running cattle up the Caribou Trail with Roeder, and he starts leaving Elizabeth completely alone with children and what was becoming a dairy operation here more than a cattle operation. Mrs. Judson's book makes it look like she ran off with a guy named Ned that worked for them, but it's not true. Ned's father was a native doctor right over the line, and she had tuberculosis from the milk. If you've heard of milk tuberculosis, bovine tuberculosis. She and all the other wives that were taking care of the cows there, all of them died of this. And she went up there, Ned took her up there to get help, and she died. She did not desert her children. At that time, no woman, white or native, had any rights to their own children. So sometimes you see that some woman deserted her kids, but it's not what it seems, because the husband could get the sheriff and come after those children and do whatever he wanted with them, and she had no rights to them. So after she died, that's how the Judsons got here to take care of the kids. So Here's how her chapter begins. It's called Elizabeth, Daughter of the Moon. Bellingham's 1925 Tulip Time Grand Parade was at hand. Fraternal groups, bands, and flower-bedecked floats from Seattle and Canada would proceed down Cornwall Avenue behind the Tulip Queen. Two avid readers and prominent pioneer daughters, Dolly and Nellie Patterson, probably saw local newspaper articles about parade plans with a mixture of pride, bemusement, and even offense. Organizers announced that in the spirit of the year's focus on early residents, Indians would be a central feature and join the last known surviving veteran of Captain George Pickett's Fort Bellingham command. Lummi men would represent their forebears, who supplemented Pickett's soldiers to protect Bellingham Bay. Behind a Salish canoe carrying locals representing Henry Roeder and Russell Peabody's arrival on the bay would be the float depicting the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott. Lummi men portraying Chawitsut, Snoqualmie Chief Pat Canham, and other Coast Salish leaders would reenact the moment they signed away millions of acres to the American government. Swinomish and Lummi men would march with the float and be applauded by thousands. On parade day, another float showcased the Alaskan Haida winner of a Seattle Indian beauty contest, adorned with a Plains Indian headdress. Her float's banner proclaimed her the real American queen. Symptomatic of the town's ambivalence toward their indigenous neighbors, organizers did not invite any young Nooksack or Lummi women to join her. Neither did anyone invite Dolly and Nellie to join the parade, despite the fact that their late mother, Elizabeth Patterson, was the daughter of treaty signer, Chief Pat Canham. By 1925, few people from Bellingham or Lyndon knew the two women were his grandchildren or that the treaty moment portrayed was a history-changing event in their own family's past. Okay, so the third woman is Mary Allen. She was from up the Fraser River, from a First Nations group whose name I will not try to pronounce because they tried to teach it to me and I just slaughter it, and I feel that's disrespectful. It's the reason why whites came to call her group the Thompson River First Nations. Where she was from, Spuzzum, was sitting on the border between Coast Salish territory, where you've fished for salmon, and outward towards the sea, and the plateau culture, which was hunting and going further east. Her father was the leader at Spuzzum during the Canyon War of 1858, and her grandfather, Palek, was the guide for when explorer Simon Fraser came down the Fraser River in 1808. She married Solomon Allen, who was from a southern Illinois farm family. He'd gone to the California gold rush and had not done well, and what gold he found, he lost. So then he went up to Oregon, and to a gold rush in Oregon around Wairika. He managed to get some more gold, and then it got stolen. And then he went to the Fraser River, where he lost his gold overboard in the river. So he wasn't a very successful farmer either. However, the Allens provided the land for the first rural school in Whatcom County. And in 1883, they platted and founded the village of Marietta out there at where the Nooksack River came out. It's mostly gone now. It's very much flooded. They had 5 sons and 1 daughter she died at the age of 12, but that's where the name Marietta comes from, her name. The boys, some of them went back to where the Allens were in Illinois and went to school in Centralia, Illinois, and St. Louis. And then all of them ended up going up to Alaska, where they were instrumental in the development of Petersburg and Southeast Alaska. Mary lived long enough to be a friend of the boy, Howard Buswell, and who lived very near to where they were. And so he interviewed her many times and then interviewed all of her children and her daughter-in-law that he knew very well. So that's another reason we have all these wonderful primary sources over at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies in the Buswell collection. This is how her chapter begins. It's called Mary from the Rapids. All day long, the sweaty crowd in the imposing new sandstone courthouse grew. They spilled out of the second-floor courtroom into the hallway and down the grand staircase. By the time the clerk called the final witness of the day, the lucky standees filled the center aisle and formed two great hollow squares around the seated audience. Those outside the courtroom strained to hear. A slender, brown-eyed boy wound his way through the perspiring mass to the witness stand, watched over by his parents, Mary and Solomon Allen. The next day, the Fairhaven Herald would describe the youngest witness as bright and cute. Though only 12 years old, Jimmy Allen was the pivotal witness in a murder case that infuriated the county's white residents and galvanized Lummi Nation. No one had ever seen the Lummi people fill a courtroom in support of one of their own before. Neither had anyone ever seen a Lummi defended by an expensive and eloquent Seattle lawyer like Samuel Piles, very soon to be U.S. Senator Piles. On young Allen's testimony rested the life of George Suilus, the first cousin of his family's friends, Jenny Winn, Clara Tennant, and Chief Henry Quina. It was March 1892, and most Whatcom County newcomers knew nothing about Jimmy's family history or that of the defendant, but to Lummi Nation and the old settlers, he was the son of Mary Allen, a Thompson River First Nation woman from British Columbia. His father, Solomon Allen, was one of the 1858 Fraser River gold miners who returned with his family and settled at the mouth of the eastern fork of the Nooksack River. 11 years earlier, Jimmy's parents had platted the new village of Marietta across from Lummi Reservation. His mother and father occupied the cultural middle ground of Whatcom County that for 30 years had enabled them to be friends of both Coast Salish and settler communities. The prosecution and the defense might trust the biracial boy's version of events. The fourth woman is Mrs. Pickett, who is the Pickett headlines right now about the bridge. Hope you've all seen that. So I and Wes and Edradine back there and a couple of others appeared before the Planning Commission a couple of weeks ago to basically plead to leave that plaque where it was. We got nowhere. They'd already made up their minds. So I'm not a happy camper. But her name was not Morning Mist, which I gave a program on that several years ago. It came from a 1937 book. She was called Mrs. Pickett, which is the title that all U.S. Army fort commanders' wives were called by. They were not called ever by their first names. I have concluded that, yes, the stories that she was Alaskan Haida are true, because I'm going with the nearest two eyewitnesses, which was Jimmy Pickett's second foster father, William Walter, and the knowledge that there were Haida families living and working at Semiahmoo, which is where Pickett met her. She died in 1858 after Jimmy was born on New Year's Eve, and I finally have kind of tracked down what I think she died from. She didn't die from childbirth. I believe she died in the late winter epidemic that came, and downhill from the Pickett house over there was a longhouse that belonged to Salish, Clara Tennant's father, and it was used for mill workers to live in. And I think that some of the women down there came up to visit her, their friend, and see the new baby, and unwittingly transferred this illness to her. It's a very strange epidemic. I can find nothing that really resembles it. But there were many people who had been gathered into town so that E.C. Fitzhugh, who was the son of a doctor and a fellow Indian agent, could try to take care of people and get the epidemic stopped. So after she died, I think Jimmy stayed locally. There's some evidence that he stayed with the Roders, who could take care of this little boy while his father was fort commander. After the Pig War, and then George had to leave for the Civil War, I tried to plead the case at the Planning Commission meeting that he was a reluctant Confederate. He had lost, while he was here, he lost both parents. He had already lost a wife before he lost this one. Little Jimmy was basically his only nearest relative that he could be with. And he put it off as long as possible until his cousin was in the newspaper as having joined up, and a very close cousin. And so the Army was going to make him take a new loyalty oath, and so he left. And Jimmy went down to Aaron and Catherine Collins down near Shelton. This is always written up as a Mr. and Mrs. Collins. And I have written a complete account of who these two wonderful, wonderful people were, who ended up informally adopting him, because after the war, George was absolutely penniless, and he had to be told that it was probably, he was never going to have enough money to come back here or to bring Jimmy out there, so they informally adopted him. Jimmy grew up in a mixed neighborhood of many intermarried couples. He was not isolated, he was not a misfit, he was not disliked, he was a much-loved child and an artistic prodigy who was supported both by the community there and the community in Olympia. He went to the San Francisco School of Design, which was the first professional art school west of the Mississippi. He became a staff artist for the Oregonian newspapers. He did lithographs for those big giant county histories that were done in the 1800s. And along with three friends from San Francisco whose wonderful artworks I have seen, the four of them founded Portland's Professional Art Association. He also did the most detailed bird's eye view of Bellingham that we have. He was totally into precision and detail. And this painting that we now have came to Charles Roth, who was Henry Roeder's son-in-law, Lottie Roeder Roth's husband, because Roth was a lawyer who represented Jimmy when he came here to claim the lot that his father had bought in 1858 and had kept all those years. This is the 1880s now. But Pickett's third wife, LaSalle, back in Virginia, had her own son to take care of, and she was fighting him getting this because in Virginia, a non-white could not be an heir or inherit anything. And Roth represented him, and it's a very unique document that Jimmy made LaSalle sign, a document that he is the legal heir of George Pickett. And so in payment for helping him, he gave that painting to Charles Roth, and it made its way here to the museum. The lot, where it is when you go down DuPont, up from the museum here, there's a building that's got the coffee shop downstairs, and it says Pickett 1890 up on top. That's the lot. Across the street from it, on the same side of DuPont, at the time Pickett bought it, was an empty lot with a little shack on it that was the county courthouse, where they were keeping records, and that was to be the town square. So Pickett was choosing a lot that would sit right on the town square, which of course never developed. So here's how her chapter begins. Mrs. Pickett, the commander's wife. Two handsome young men tentatively shook hands in San Francisco on a spring day in 1885. Both had thick shocks of dark brown hair and even darker eyes, and both were deeply loved by their families. In every other way, they could not have been more different. Though they were both carriers of family legacies, one was the future of his family's military tradition, The other was the blossoming of a gift of artistic talent from the mother he never knew. George Edward Pickett Jr.'s father was the legendary Confederate hero of the Battle of Gettysburg. Everyone expected him to enter the Army, and his mother wanted him to marry into another prominent Confederate family. This West Coast trip freed him from her smothering domination and the personally stifling atmosphere of Virginia, where his name could both help and hinder. The other was James Tilton Pickett, the half-Indigenous son of the General's cross-cultural marriage and a serious artist who was studying at the first professional art school west of the Mississippi. He looked forward to meeting his younger half-brother, the other son of a father James knew only through letters written before the General died a decade earlier. He had never met another blood relative after his dimly remembered father left Washington Territory. George Jr. knew about James too, but since his father died when he was 11, he may not have known the full truth. His mother concocted a Southern woman's acceptable explanation for the presence of a mixed-blood child in her late husband's life. She told everyone that a Lummi chief gave his baby son to then Captain Pickett in gratitude for his mercy after the defeat of thousands of Lummi warriors. Being a polite man, she lied, her future husband adopted the boy. People believed her. The artist and the first family of Virginia, Scion, separated by 7 years of age, geography, and mutually foreign lifestyles, crossed their personal divide. The meeting did not go well, but perhaps not for the reason James thought. Both men were probably stunned when they stood face to face. George could not deny what James always knew. There was no adoption. They were brothers. It was almost like looking into a mirror. George's eyes told him that James was his half-brother left behind when Captain Pickett joined the Confederacy. It was clear that his mother fabricated the explanation for her continued interest in a stepson across the continent. George's reaction when confronted with his older brother's Indianness deeply hurt the sensitive artist. James saw only racial arrogance and overbearing Southern snobbery. The young man dreamed of joining his family in Virginia one day, as his father once promised. After the meeting, he realized his dreams had always been just that, and his hopes for a relationship with George died. James never saw his brother again. I do want to stick something in here. Mrs. Pickett, LaSalle, who made the legend by writing books and speaking, and concocted that crazy story. She did want her son to marry into a very prominent Confederate family. She hoped he would marry the daughter of a general or a colonel or something. And what happened was that George rebelled in the most obvious way possible. He married the daughter of a Union colonel who was the chief of staff to General George Meade at Gettysburg. They did not invite LaSalle to the wedding at all. But what is most wonderful about this couple is that they made a pact that in their home they would never, ever speak of the war. And they had 2 sons. And those boys did not discover until they went away to school what their grandfathers had done in the war. They had never heard of Pickett's charge or anything else. And such strength of character of that young couple to say, we will never speak of this in our home, and then be able to do it. The other thing I just want to bring out is the legacies that these women left behind. So, Jenny Winn and her husband, besides donating those land, they founded a family of teachers, educators. They're in like the 5th generation now, and this is who they are. This is who they see themselves as educators, starting from what Jenny and Tom treasured, which was education. Did anybody go to Bellingham High School? If you took French from Echo Dore, she is Jenny Winn's great-granddaughter, I think, or was her great-great-granddaughter. Anybody go to Ferndale High School? At Ferndale High School, there is a scholarship now called the Vivian Winn Scholarship. She was head of the math department there and was a descendant of Tom and Jenny. Elizabeth Patterson's legacies are those two daughters. First of all, if Elizabeth hadn't died, the Judsons would never have come to that ranch and founded the town of Linden upon that ranch's land. Dolly's husband was from New York, and who came there, and he founded the first industry in Linden. Nellie married a Scot from Ontario named James MacDonald, and they built the 2 clipper mills and one up in Everson. And for many decades, and I have pictures of Nellie and these other women spanning, I think, 40 years. Nellie founded, out in that isolated little village of Clipper, the Clipper Reading Circle. And the women of the mill workers would read magazine articles and books and then get together and self-educate themselves for decades. And Mary Allen and her husband left us the village of Marietta, and of course some of the development of Petersburg, and their granddaughter became the first postcard photographer of Alaska. So if anybody buys an antique postcard from Alaska, it was probably, the photograph on it was probably taken by Mary Cecilia Allen. And Mrs. Pickett, of course, left us Jimmy and his talent, and this painting and the many others that are out there. They're mostly in private hands. Some are in museums, some are missing. But when they rarely ever come up for sale, they sell for $50,000 and up. And he died at 30, almost 32, of a combination of typhoid and tuberculosis down in Portland. And you think, where would he have been as an artist in 30 years if he had lived longer? He would have been incredible. But he's considered one of the foundation artists of the California School of Landscape Painting. This is my next book. I'm writing a full biography of Fitzhugh. I have about 6 feet of stuff on Fitzhugh that I collected over these same years, who was the husband of Mary Fitzhugh Phillips and Julia Seaholm. He had 2 wives at one time, which you were allowed to do under Coast Salish culture, but he's the only person we know that was white that took advantage of that. He had married little Julia, and she was about 15, 16, and she was so homesick. And so Mary had been widowed from her, I think, Swinomish husband, and her child died too. And so I think Seaholm recommended that she come up here and become a secondary wife. What Fitzhugh did was to kidnap his own children. The women went out berry picking one day, and when they came home, the children were no longer there. They each had a child. And they didn't get back together with those children until they were practically adults. And so what happened was the women left him that day and never came back. So that would be an Indian divorce, yeah. But more often the men died. We often hear stories, oh, these men just deserted these women on the drop of a dime, but that isn't really true of these county officials, men that I wrote about, yeah. And the military guys, they had to leave, so that was, inevitable.